In this video, we have some factoring review. Starting with letter A, we have x cubed minus 8x squared. It's a binomial, something with two terms. We can think, is it a difference of two squares or is there a greatest common factor? Well, 8 is not a square number, so 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is already 9. 8 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to try to pull out a greatest common factor. So the biggest number that goes into 1, x cubed, and 8, x squared, the biggest number would just be 1. And the least power of x I see is x squared. Or you can just write it as x squared, it doesn't matter. X squared times x would give me x cubed. X squared times a negative 8 would give me negative 8x squared. So pulling out our greatest common factor for the first one, letter A. I'm going to jump over to letter D because it's another binomial. So I want to think, is it a difference of two square numbers or is it another greatest common factor like we just did? Well, I noticed 9 is a perfect square. 9 is 3 squared. So this would be 9s getting squared minus 49 is 7 squared. So I'm going to write it as 3s plus 7 times 3s minus 7. Adding and subtracting my two perfect square numbers. The next ones we have here are trinomials, which means I can't look for a difference of two squares like we just did. I could look for a greatest common factor, or I can do some reverse foiling. So looking at letter B, I want to multiply to be negative 20. So that's going to help me set this up. This is going to be t plus a number times t minus a number. Only a positive times a negative could multiply to be a negative. Two positives would be positive, and two negatives would multiply to be positive. So I want ones that add up to be a negative 1. So I want factors that differ by 1. So if I go through my factors of 20, 20 times 1 is not going to work. We want the bigger number to be the negative 1 so that it adds up to be a negative, but negative 20 plus 1 would give me negative 19. So move on to different factors of 20. I might try negative 10 to be the bigger number times 2. That still multiplies to be negative 20, but negative 10 plus 2 is going to be negative 8, and I only want it to be negative 1. So I want the bigger number to be the negative 1 to add up to be a negative, but I don't want to add up to be negative 8. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to have negative 5 times 4. Negative 5 times 4 is still negative 20, and negative 5 plus 4 is negative 1. So I'm just going to be plus 4 minus 5 will give me negative 1 there. We're going to do the same thing with the one below that, letter C. I want to think about what multiplies to be the last number and adds up to be the middle term. So I'm going to multiply to be a positive 40, which means I could have two positives or two negatives. But I want to add up to be a negative 14, so it must be two negative numbers. It would multiply to be a positive 40, but add up to be a negative 14. So I want to think about two negative numbers. So if I do negative 40 times negative 1, that is positive 40, but negative 40 minus 1 is negative 41. So I'm not going to use those. I'm going to keep going. Do negative 20 times negative 2 is positive 40, but those add up to be negative 22. So I'm going to keep going. Maybe negative 10 times negative 4 would still be positive 40, but negative 10 minus 4 is also going to add up to be that negative 14. So you have negative 10 and negative 4 would multiply to be positive 40 and add up to be negative 14. So there is some review of some basic factoring with the greatest common factor, difference of squares, and reverse foiling. We're going to do these last two in the next video. They have a coefficient in front of the x squared, so it's not just 1x squared, which means we're going to use the AC method.